And section 5 is the key one, meaning of change or suppression practice. The bill is the Change and Suppression Practices Prohibition Bill. So what is it prohibiting? A change and suppression practice. Here's the meaning of that phrase. And it says this: in this act, a change or suppression practice means a practice or conduct directed towards a person, whether with or without the person's consent, for the purpose of, or it says on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity, and for the purpose of, 1, changing or suppressing the sexual orientation or gender identity of the person, or 2, inducing the person to change or suppress their sexual orientation or gender identity. So let's step that out. Firstly, the Act bans conduct. So practice or conduct. Conduct's the widest. What does conduct include? Literally any action whatsoever by anyone. Conduct is a very, very broad word. And specifically, it is conduct that is directed towards a person with or without the person's consent. So in other words, it makes no difference if somebody requests it. A person cannot voluntarily seek out the things that this bill prohibits, and you cannot respond to them if they do. Now, it goes on from there to specifically say for the purpose of those things, changing or suppressing or inducing the person to change or suppress. Okay, we're going to go through some case studies and see if they satisfy those criteria in just a minute, but let me make some further observations. The very next section, 5.2, makes it very, very clear that this is a one-way street. This bill does not apply to any conduct that seeks to change or induce a change to a homosexual orientation or to a transgender identity. It doesn't apply to assisting a person to transition in those directions. It doesn't apply to conduct that is pro-LGBT. It only applies to conduct that is of a Christian view on these matters. That's clear. It's ideological. It's imbalanced. Section 5.3, which follows again, gives some specific examples of conduct that definitely is included in that definition that I just read out before. And it says that, conduct includes but isn't limited to. So it's just giving some examples, and it's making the point there's lots of others. But in these some examples that it gives, I draw your attention to this. It includes carrying out a religious practice, including but not limited to a prayer-based practice. Religion and prayer is specifically included as an example of prohibited illegal conduct under this definition. Also, it says it includes, but isn't limited to, giving a person a referral for the purposes of a change or suppression practice being directed to the person. So, in other words, if you say, go and speak to Joe, go and speak to Bob, go and speak to someone who's had a similar experience to you or been on a similar journey, no, that also is criminal. That also is prohibited. You cannot refer them on to somebody else. The explanatory notes of the bill actually go further, and they say that it is intended to capture a broad range of conducts. They're emphasising breadth, and the objects clause of the bill in section 3 is the same. They emphasise the breadth. It says including informal practices and including conversations with a community leader that encourage change or suppression. So a conversation about celibacy, right? Suppression. This is intended to include all of that stuff. Really wide. I mentioned the objects clause. It actually says that the bill's purpose, among other things, includes making sure that LGBT people feel welcome and valued in Victoria and are able to live authentically and with pride. So anything that can be seen as derogating from that pride standard and that welcoming and valued standard, so total affirmation of everything, falls short within the objects clause of this bill. In other words, it's outside. In other words, the bill is intended to capture it and make it unlawful. Now, Section 8 of the bill, which follows from the other sections I've just been reading, makes this important point. A lot of people say, well, I'm glad I'm not in Victoria. Oh, Victoria, at it again. Not so fast. Section 8 is titled Extraterritorial Application. This section applies if a person engages in conduct outside Victoria. This Act has effect in relation to that conduct as if it had been engaged wholly within Victoria if a significant part of the conduct occurs in Victoria, or the conduct occurred wholly outside Victoria, but the effects of the conduct occurred wholly or partly in Victoria. So people in Sydney, people in Perth, people in Oodnadatta, People in Alice Springs, people on the Sunshine Coast, I can tell you this, if you say something that is heard or consumed, like content on the internet or whatever, by people who are in Victoria, or you're doing things that someone in Victoria encounters, hears, or comes into contact with, you too are doing something illegal under the terms of this Act. This is not just about Victoria. That's really important to get straight. This has national implication. That's why I said I don't live in Victoria. I said this bill would send people like me to jail. I mean that. I live outside Victoria. But this clause means that this very video, going into Victorian listeners is a big problem for me under the terms of this bill. Now, I want to go back to the definition I read out before and just quickly see whether we can actually do a case study. For example, let's take a pastor. Let's call him Jim. Let's say that he's just preached a sermon on Christian marriage, and within that was a discussion of Christian sexual ethics and saying, you should abstain outside of marriage. Marriage is one man, one woman. The homosexual option is not God's plan. It's not right. They read from Ephesians 5. They read from Romans 1, etc. Totally bog standard sermon on the issue. A new member of the church, and let's call him Adrian, approaches Pastor Jim afterwards and tells Pastor Jim that he sometimes feels attracted to other men, but that he really wants, first and foremost, to follow God's will for his life. He wants actually to be married to a woman, to be a family man one day. He asks if Pastor Jim would pray for him. Pastor Jim puts his hand on Adrian's shoulder, says a prayer, assures Adrian that he's available for any support he needs, and affirms that what he is seeking to do is a very good thing. First, was it conduct? Remember the definition? Was it conduct? Of course it was. In fact, it was one of those conducts, is that a word? One of those actions was conduct specifically named within the bill. Prayer, as an example, if you recall. Second, was it directed towards a person? Of course it was. Third, was it on the basis of that person's sexual orientation or gender identity? Yes, arguable in the first, definitely in the second. But I think in the first, very arguable because the sermon was partly about that issue. Fourth, was it for the purpose of inducing a person to change or suppress their sexual orientation or gender identity? Well, yes, it was. I mean, Pastor Jim is hoping that the things he's saying will be taken seriously. Pastor Jim is hoping that he's teaching people to do the right thing. And that's what he wants the outcome to be. Of course it was for that reason. And he says, God's will is this. God's approval rests on this kind of behaviour. There you go. He's inducing someone to heteronormative living. Fifth, does it matter that it was with Andrew's consent? Does it matter that Adrian, I'm getting my names mixed up. Does it matter that it was with Adrian's consent or that Adrian requested it? Makes no difference. Remember, it said conduct with or without the person's consent. The sermon alone satisfies the criteria. The prayer alone satisfies the criteria. That is criminal. That is potential criminality. That is illegal conduct under the specific terms of this bill that I just read to you. It's straightforward. It's not complex. It's not unclear. It's not in doubt. That's what the bill says. Or take this alternative scenario. What if the sermon was delivered in Sydney? What if Pastor Jim lives in Sydney? And what if he posts his sermons online? And Adrian discovers this sermon on the church website and he's living in Melbourne. Or maybe he had an email exchange with Pastor Jim rather than a conversation. Pastor Jim's actions are still illegal. Pastor Jim is still captured under this bill. Doesn't matter where he lives. It could have been from Darwin. Doesn't matter. Or what about this alternative scenario? What if Pastor Jim said to Andrew, this just isn't my area. I don't know a lot about it. I know what the Bible says, but in terms of specific support, I actually know a guy who's been on the same journey as you, and maybe he'd be helpful. Here's his email address. Again, doesn't matter whether he did that by email from another city or whether he did it in person in Victoria. Again, it's prohibited conduct. In fact, it's one of the specifically listed examples of prohibited conduct under this bill. This is the summary. Sermons and prayers are illegal. They could indeed be criminal. They could result in jail. The Bible itself induces a person to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. That's what it says. It says, hey, there's sanctification in the Christian life, and this is what happens. This is the kind of change, 1 Corinthians 6. What does that mean for reading that, for selling that book? What does that mean for any number of things? Or what about parents? Well, I'm glad you asked, because the bill includes an amendment to the Family Violence Protection Act 2008 in Section 64 of the bill. It's towards the end. Section 64 of the bill includes the following. It inserts the following specific example of emotional or psychological abuse into the Family Violence Protection Act. And here's the example. An adult child repeatedly denigrating an elderly parent's sexual orientation, including by telling them it is wrong to be same-sex attracted and that they must change or the adult child will no longer support them. Now you immediately see that's a weird example. When do you get that from a child to a parent? You don't really. But of course the example is included because if it's in there, it automatically, by extension, it logically applies in reverse. This is the deception of it. What they really would like the example to say is a parent who doesn't approve the sexual orientation or gender identity of their child with full affirmation, that parent is actually a psychological abuser. Now, the way they've worded it there, no Christian parent, I hope, would denigrate their child. No Christian parent I know would say they don't support their child. But every Christian parent I know just about would certainly say, well, here's the standard of right and wrong, and that's what we believe. And they'd encourage it in the home. Well, I'm glad you asked. All of a sudden, parents are in trouble under the terms of this bill. Not to mention, apart from that little section, this definition in Section 5, their conduct towards a person, blah, blah. There's no exception here for parents. There's no exception here for medical practitioners. There's no exception here for religious practitioners. It's just blanket. So parents are definitely included. In fact, every Christian parent under this bill has been made into emotional and psychological abusers of their children. And note that there's nothing said about the age of the child. A 4-year-old? And we're not just talking about mature minors. We're talking about all children, all parents. Other examples abound. You can think of them. Health practitioners who search for underlying causes when gender dysphoric children come to see them. And they say, well, is there psychosis? Is there mania? Is there depression? Is there sexual abuse? Maybe actually in your case, I don't think that full affirmation is the right way to go. I think there's a good chance you'll grow out of this. The statistics say that there are a good chance that you'll grow out of this. You wouldn't want to do irreversible life-changing surgery at your age or hormones at your age, which cannot be reversed. You wouldn't want to do that. Oh, well, they're not affirming, are they? They run dangerously close to running foul of this bill. Or ex-LGBT people who offer support to other ex-LGBT people. There's plenty of those people. In fact, this bill erases a whole class of LGBT people by telling them that the state knows better than they do, because there's a whole class who say, well, actually, I'm a Christian first, or I'm a person of faith first, and that's more important to me, and I want to live that way. Well, this bill says, no, you can't get any help about that, and you can't be taught that. You can't get what you want. It doesn't matter if it's voluntary, it's all wrong. They erase that class of people, this bill does, and pretends they don't exist, and they do exist. There's a lot of them. Christian schools, codes of conduct and behavioural standards, or a youth group's code of conduct and behavioural standards. Is that inducing someone to change? Probably, because they're saying, well, you can have membership here, you can attend this school, you can go to this youth group, if you abide by this code of conduct. Well, that's a problem, potentially, isn't it? The prohibition extends actually to ideas of abstinence and celibacy, because that's suppression, not allowing them to fully live out their sexual persuasions. This extends to the things that I've said in my videos about Christian teaching on the subject. And that's not even the end, worryingly, and I don't know whether this would ever end up in court, but it's a possibility under the terms of this bill, because the definition of sexual orientation is such that it includes heterosexual people. So suppressing heterosexual conduct, as in with celibacy, abstinence and this kind of thing, is that running foul of the bill? On the strict terms of that definition, it looks likely. Now, I don't know if that would ever be brought as a case, but it just shows how unbelievably broad the bill actually is. Every conversation on this subject is affected, even private conversations, even consensual conversations. Every action done in relation to this subject, every Bible verse about this subject, every Christian institution with a code of conduct, every counsellor, doctor, teacher, pastor, parent, foster carer, every average Joe is affected by this. Every conversation, every written word, every book, every website, every parent, every leader, every friend, every author, all are affected by this. And by the way, what this bill does is it makes crimes and it puts in place fines and criminal penalties, sections 10 and 11. Section 10 is the first offence that is set up by this bill. And what it says is that if you do these things and it causes serious injury, then you are going to jail for 10 years or you're being fined $200,000. Or Section 11 says if you do these things and it causes injury, not serious injury, but injury, then you can go to jail for 5 years and receive a $100,000 fine, or in both cases, both of those things can happen. You can go to jail and be fined in both cases. Now, this is where apologists for the bill will say that I'm being alarmist, because for jail terms to result, for this kind of punishment to result, there needs to be injury. Injury. But I want to make this important point. What is injury? According to Section 4 of this bill in the definitions, injury has the same meaning as that in the Crimes Act, which includes temporary injury, so it includes temporary stuff that doesn't last, and it includes harm to mental health on a temporary basis. Now, there will be no problem whatsoever getting a rainbow flag waving counsellor or a shrink of some kind to say that somebody's anguish over their LGBT identification has been exacerbated by something said in a church, or a prayer prayed by a person, or a rule laid down by a parent, or a line in a book, or a course of treatment from a medical professional, or something that they were told by a friend, or an advertisement for counselling support or anything else. There'll be no problem finding that. To get somebody who is in a professional capacity in the medical profession to say, yes, this caused temporary mental injury or contributed to temporary mental injury in my client, in my patient. And straight away you blow open the whole suite of criminal sanctions that this bill outlines. But it's not just that, you know. Last point I'll make is this. Jail does not have to be involved. The bill empowers the ideologues in the Equal Opportunity Commission to investigate, sections 34 and 35, to demand the production of information or documents, section 36, to impose remedies on people and organisations, section 32 and 33. It permits the Commission to refer matters to the police, section 29. Of course, these are criminal offences, so you'd imagine. It permits anyone at all to complain, whether or not they're affected, section 24. It permits their identity to remain secret, section 40, and the content of their complaint to remain secret, section 41. You can also be summoned to the Commission and made to give an answer for yourself, section 37. You can be forced into a legally binding agreement of pretty much any kind to remedy or make reparation for the things that you do in Division 4. So this will result in stressful, protracted investigations, which could involve, honestly, police knocking at your door, which could involve you being forced to give up whatever documents the Commission wants, whatever information the Commission wants from you, which will be conducted with the threat of jail hanging over your head, and which can be done in secret. And that will be one of the real weapons of this bill. In fact, they are empowered to produce educational materials. And I forgot to include here, actually, there's a section there that says they can re-educate. So they can come and try and re-educate you. I mean, like I said at the start, this would make the Soviets blush. And like I said at the start, don't take my word for it. I have substantially read to you from this bill to show you what it says. I'm not kidding. There it is. Welcome to Daniel Andrews, Victoria. And now, given that it has extra outside of the state application, welcome to Daniel Andrews, Australia. This bill needs to be fought with everything we've got. We're not making it up. That was, in fact, the truth of it about the Change and Suppression Conversion Practices Prohibition Bill 2020. Hey, one more thing. You know, I've been looking at the metrics and I figured out something. You guys are watching the videos and not subscribing. So please help us out a great deal by hitting the like button and then hitting subscribe, hitting the bell as well so you get the notifications. It helps us out a really great deal, and you can click here to see more videos.